When I first met Garrison, I would have been at that time early in my time in those two positions, and I also was the music director at Minnesota Opera. And so he called me up in that year of '74, and he didn't know me, I didn't know him. He said he was starting a radio show, and he was looking for somebody who knew classical music and hymns. And I can remember I said to him, that's me. And he said, do you really know a lot of hymns? And I said, every hymn you know, I know. The question will be, who knows more verses? And that ended up being exactly right, because we came from similar backgrounds. We both knew all of those gospel and evangelistic hymns of that era. The 6th of July, 1974, just to be sure, I went back and looked at my old date book for 1974 to make sure that indeed I had that date down, and I did. And in fact, I had down June 22nd as a meeting with Garrison to kind of, I suppose, introduce ourselves to each other and talk a little bit about what might happen on that very first show. I don't remember much about it except that it was rather extemporaneous. You know, in those early days, it wasn't like a national broadcast that had to be timed to the second. And so, you know, if things had gone a little over, it would have been okay. Vern Sutton was there, and I accompanied Vern. And what he sang, I don't remember, but I had, of course, had known Vern since 1961 when I went to the University of Minnesota. So it was a very friendly atmosphere, and you felt at ease just being involved in the show. And of course, in later years, things had to be a little more scripted just in terms of time so that we knew. But even so, things were, you know, there's always been that feeling of comfort that you never really felt, you know, a great deal of pressure and tension. You just knew, okay, get it done. And Garrison has and still has a wonderful way of just involving you just enough, and you sort of knew when we needed to get on into the music and stop the conversation. I do remember that Butch Thompson was on in the early days, and we then realized that we had been in theory class together at the University of Minnesota with Miss Malcolm back in the early '60s. And so there were several friendships like that that developed. Garrison had this idea that Vern Sutton and Janice Hardy and I should create Thanksgiving cantatas. And the idea was that the audience would be asked when they came into the theater to take a little slip of paper and write something they were thankful for. And then as the show started, we were given these baskets of little slips of paper and sent to the basement of the theater, which, by the way, in those days was freezing cold. And it was not at all elegant in the least. And we were put in a room to try to sort out what were the categories that we had. Were they people? Were they food? Were they experiences? And figure out what we had. And then I started typing it all up and then figuring out what we were going to make it be. And this all had to be done by 90 minutes in so that the last half hour we could present a cantata. We always did it. Sometimes the themes were really strange, but it all worked. I think the reason Garrison knew we could do it was that in 1974, that was also the year that at Minnesota Opera we did an entire evening opera that was improvised called The Newest Opera in the World. And it was called that because every night was the newest opera. It had never been heard before. So he knew that Janice and Vern and I, and several other people, but particularly Janice and Vern, really had a skill at knowing how to improvise on their feet and making it work. Janice had her dog Freckles on the show, and Freckles was just a mutt, but for some reason, when Janice sang, this dog There was something in the vibrations that made this dog, he would just sit there like, you know, very like a dog does, but then all of a sudden she'd start singing, and little by little his head would go straight up so that his nose was looking up to the ceiling, and he would start going, woo! And it would get louder, and Janice just kept singing. And when she did something like Indian Love Call, it was, I mean, the audience was totally gone, as was Garrison. I can remember that very well. Janice kept her poise, of course, and the dog, and she knelt next to it and petted it, so it, you know, it didn't totally get freaked by this audience screaming of laughter, and it just went on. It was an amazing, wonderful experience.